Shay, it's almost Thanksgiving. And whenever Thanksgiving comes around, I think about the story of the first Thanksgiving.
Ah, yes. You mean that incredible coming together of native peoples and colonizers to share a feast, break bread over mutual respect and understanding.
I sense your sarcasm there.
Right. The story that we grew up with is nowhere close to the real story, or at least it's one sided. It doesn't consider the fraught history leading up to Thanksgiving.
hmm We think of this story of the Europeans inviting Native Americans to their feast as an act of peace and friendship.
Positive vibes.
Yep, we hear all these positive vibes between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoag tribes, but it was not quite like that.
Mm-mm.
The first Thanksgiving at Plymouth was kind of a fluke. Yes, there was a feast celebrating the first successful harvest the Pilgrims had, and members of the Wampanoag tribes were invited,
Mm.
but this was the exception to the rule. For years, the English had been coming over, slaughtering, capturing, kidnapping, enslaving members of native tribes, spreading deadly diseases all along the eastern coast of the US.
Mm.
But in 1621, the Pilgrims had struck a peace agreement with Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag, simply because Massasoit needed a political ally against other neighboring tribes.
Go figure.
And so we have this alliance, and yes, Native Americans are invited to the first Thanksgiving, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
but it's couched in a much deeper history of trickery, looting, disease, and genocide.
And the atrocities against Native Americans did not end there. They have continued on and on throughout the history of our country.
No wonder many Indigenous groups refer to Thanksgiving as Day of Mourning to commemorate the millions of Indigenous people lost to colonization. I'm sure seeing people celebrating the positive myths surrounding Thanksgiving can be frustrating and painful.
Right. For those present for what we refer to as the first Thanksgiving, it did not become a warm, fuzzy tradition. It was just a one off. And our focus on this isolated event led to its becoming a holiday celebrated in the US, a blind celebration of togetherness that conveniently leaves out the stories and experiences of Native peoples. That is actually incredibly myopic and maintains the messaging that those in power wanted to convey.
Right. So we're not going to dwell much more on Thanksgiving, but it gives us an entry point into this episode's topic, representation.
Mhm. In our last episode, we touched upon the connection between language and power, particularly how the English language has gained geopolitical power and how that can have an effect on the people using it and those learning it.
And in this episode, we'll go beyond the question of which language is being used and why, but how those in power ultimately determine what stories are told over the course of history, whose perspectives are being represented and suppressed.
Showing your students that there has been a historical imbalance in voices represented, in stories told, not only demonstrates our interest in representing all of the brilliance that exists in different human experiences in our classrooms, but it also creates a foundation for them to go on and ensure that their stories are told in the future. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shay.
And I'm Anna.
As we begin to peel back the shiny wrapping paper that keeps the topic of representation in the language classroom neatly packaged and inconspicuous, we want to take a moment to acknowledge our innate privilege.
We are white people, middle class, cisgender. We're university educators, albeit adjuncts. So, yeah, in talking about equity and representation, we recognize that we're sitting in a position of privilege.
Yeah. So as we come into this episode, we do so with great empathy and humility. We want to be part of the conversation, but we're not claiming that what we're saying is the one and only position on this. And of course, with the nature of our privilege comes limitation of understanding.
But with privilege comes also the opportunity to stand on a soapbox occasionally and call these challenges to the surface. There's discomfort in recognizing your privilege, but it's necessary to sit with that discomfort to fully understand the implications of representation or lack thereof, and then be able to enact change.
And we're not experts either. Our reflections here are specific to our experience as classroom educators, trying to be better for our students, for our colleagues. We are grounded within advocacy, and our advocacy within the realm of education is where we can most properly place our energy surrounding this idea of representation.
Of course, when we think about equity, there are a lot of roadblocks in thinking about equity or attaining equity before students even arrive in our classrooms, right? There are a lot of systemic issues in our society that ultimately dictate who even gains access to our classrooms.
Right. So our scope is limited, but we do have control over many other aspects of a student's experience. For example, equitable representation. That's something that we have control over.
And when we say representation, we're thinking about linguistic, ethnic, racial, gender identity, sexuality, physical ability.
Representation for all, especially these groups that may not be accepted as part of the so-called dominant or mainstream culture. Entire groups of people that are shunned and stigmatized based on their difference from some made up social norm. And that can be challenging depending on your context. Representation requires some sort of approval on the societal level before educators can start ensuring representation in their classrooms. If you're in a community where, say, the existence of LGBTQIA plus communities are not recognized as valid for different reasons, it's going to be hard as a teacher to represent them.
Absolutely. There's a limit we have to acknowledge based on your context, right? But still, within the teaching context we do live in, we can at least try to represent more minoritized groups. And I use this term minoritized deliberately. Members of these groups aren't necessarily a statistical minority. We consider women a minority, but they're half the population, right? So these groups, these minoritized groups, are actually part of what we could call the global majority. We often lump them, including English learners, into the term minority, which is essentially a tactic for social marginalization.
Right. It's more accurate to say they've been minoritized. But I think some educators shy away from representation work altogether because it feels overwhelming. How can they ensure everyone in their class is feeling heard and valued? It's not something that can be done overnight. And I think that that can feel discouraging sometimes.
Agreed. And many of the students we work with in an ESOL context, where we work with learners of English in a country where English is the dominant language, in this context, we're often working with members of minoritized groups. So sometimes in the ESOL context, just in working with these groups, sometimes educators will assume their work is done.
Yes, their practice lends itself to serve this particular population. So their anti-discriminatory practices are already in place. Everything is okay, right?
Wrong.
Think again.
I think that working in an ESOL context makes a person more likely to fall into that line of thinking because representation is just so in your face, right? Students from all over the place. It's kind of this idea of like people saying, well, I'm not racist because I have Black friends. I'm in a relationship with someone who comes from a different ethnic background. So
we can't just claim to be supporting these minoritized groups in our classroom just by virtue of the fact that our work is based around teaching them English. Yes. There needs to be a very conscious effort to address diverse representation in our classroom. And that's facilitated very much because we have these voices already in our classroom, but that doesn't mean that it ends there.
Right. I think the most obvious way to bolster representation in our classrooms is through the creation of an atmosphere that allows the students to bring in their experiences in a genuine way.
So obviously, it's easier to achieve representation if you're teaching a more diverse class with people from a wide variety of backgrounds and identities. There's almost nothing but opportunity for intentional storytelling.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that students are going to be willing to tell the stories they have. It might not come naturally to everyone.
Your students might not feel comfortable, or they might not feel they have permission to speak their voice based on how you're presenting things. We're sort of like the gatekeepers of these really rich narratives that our students have. And so what does it mean for us to allow them to share their story?
I think it's a lot about framing. You know, we've talked about this in other situations. A lot of what we do is not like specifically what we do, but how we do it, right? how we ask the question, how we incorporate our curiosity to know things, learn new things about who our students are in our classroom.
Right. So it's not just going to happen because you're like, write a story about growing up in your home country. In those scenarios, and I'm sure, I've definitely asked students to do that before, but in those scenarios, a lot of students would choose the most superficial or sort of simple concept, writing for the purpose of our reading rather than writing for the purpose of expressing themselves through writing.
Yes, because, they think that this is what we want to read about them and their experience rather than actually sharing their true experience. But if leading up to that question, there has been more of this communal curiosity for each other, then they might give a little more, right?
I love that communal curiosity. It all goes back to routines, right? It's like, are you creating a structure that's going to facilitate that kind of sharing? Or is it just like, kind of out of the blue, like, okay, now I'm compiling this world storybook and I want you to contribute.
Yeah. Yes. Start from the very beginning. One of my favorite activities is an identity map at the beginning of the course. This was inspired by Tiffany Jewell's book. This book is Anti-Racist, which provides a lot of great social justice-oriented activities, starting with an exploration of personal identity. So the identity map has students thinking deeply about what defines them on day one. They brainstorm all of the different things that define them, not just nationality, but also relationships, likes, skills. So for example, I'm a loving daughter, a Disney fan, a terrible cook.
Yeah,
and of course, and of course, yes, besides these, other traits that define our identity, of course, nationality and language also come up.
Nice. I do a similar activity, but I was inspired by Facing History, another great online resource.
We'll link these for you listeners.
Of course. But anyway, the point here is framing identity as something complex and multifaceted from the beginning. If I remember correctly, that Tiffany Jewell book had lots of other great activities. There were some activities on telling personal, family, and community histories there too.
Yes, so many great activities in that book. Actually, I participated in a book club on anti-racist pedagogy last summer based on this book. We brainstormed more classroom activity ideas and published them on a simple web page. Shout out to my colleague and classroom-based activist, Rachel Wong. She led the book club initiative and inspires me every day to make anti-racism at the center of my practice.
What I love about these exercises is that they encourage authentic sharing. We need to be careful with representation that we're not encouraging superficial sharing. Asking students to represent themselves can feel like performative inclusivity. So, are we asking the students to share their stories because we see the value in getting them to do so? Or are we doing this to give the impression that we're being inclusive? There is a major difference.
And so that's why I think we need to be careful with this concept of giving voice to students, because the flip side of that is putting pressure on them to represent an entire group.
Right. This is such an important point. And what I think is a common misstep for educators who work with diverse populations. You want to create a platform for a student, but you might do so in a way that may not be the most productive. Like, maybe you rely on a student who is from the Dominican Republic as the sole representative of Dominican culture and constantly refer back to that student to affirm what you think you know about Dominican culture, or to even share with the class about all things Dominican.
Ugh, yes, tokenism.
That's it.
It makes me so uncomfortable when I spot tokenism, when someone says explicitly or sometimes implicitly, hey, you're a member of X group, speak for that whole group.
Right. You just want them to come forward a bit more naturally, right? It's about the way that you frame it. It's not their duty to ensure your class is well represented. Leverage student voices by creating a space where students from diverse backgrounds want to share rather than forcing it on them.
And so I want to acknowledge the fact that educators across all disciplines are being asked to ensure their classes and content represent the students they're working with. Incorporating student voices in an organic way may seem more obvious in, say, a creative writing class, right? It's much harder if you're in a business English course, or if you're I don't know, teaching how to give speeches.
Right, because anything that is very limited structurally, a student is going to have less freedom in expressing their voice.
Yes, but representing the diversity of student identities, It's not impossible to achieve in these more structured classes. There are so many research papers I've read over the years that are so impersonal. It's really hard to get someone to go personal on something so structured, especially when the point of the exercise is to learn how to write research papers in a North American context. But still, the best research papers have always been the ones that look at a very personal thing, the ones in which the students use their own voice, their own perspective and experiences, and their own analytical skills from their background to write.
And so it's not just about storytelling, people. How can you get your students to leverage their unique experiences, the lenses through which they see the world, to shine through in other activities?
Exactly.
So far, we've been focused on representation in terms of who is in our classroom. We want to give air to their voices. That's the first half of this equation. An equally important consideration, though, is the curriculum. If we want students to share authentically and represent themselves, we have to give them models, inspiration for doing so.
I feel like I have to bring up Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story here.
Listeners, drop everything and go listen to this talk if you haven't yet.
Yes, watch it and then come back to us. It's in our resource list. So one of the points Chimamanda makes is that people need to see themselves represented in the literature they're reading. She speaks from experience as an aspiring writer growing up in Nigeria, constantly reading Eurocentric narratives that she couldn't identify with.
She mentions reading about foliage and apple picking in the fall, but that it didn't resonate with her experience. She didn't grow up frolicking through fallen leaves or eating apples. And from this lack of connection, it was difficult for her to imagine that her story could hold weight, that people would want to read her stories.
So that's exactly what we want to avoid with our learners, right?
Totally.
Making them feel like their stories, experiences, ways of seeing the world are not valuable. And through the incorporation of relevant materials or content that connects to our students' experiences, we decrease the odds that they'll come away from our classrooms feeling that way.
Right. So a fundamental stepping stone to representation in the classroom is just basic content, like the videos you show, the readings you do. Maybe they're reading a book or reading a short story or a poem or watching something. And it's during that experience that they see a name that they recognize from their culture or an experience they identify with that they've lived themselves. You make it so your students feel seen and encourage them to see others too.
Yes, but not in a superficial way, right? This makes me think of a PD session I went to this past year. And one of my superiors was in a breakout room with me and a few other people. One of the topics on the list of questions we were supposed to talk about was infusing diversity, equity, and inclusion into what we're working on. And towards the end of the breakout room, we hadn't quite gotten to that question fully, so I brought it up. I was like, I don't feel like we've really talked about DEI yet. What are people doing to do this? And the superior was like, oh, well, make sure you have a picture, make sure you have a diverse name. I don't know. I was so disappointed. And then after I thought about it longer, I was furious. Like, yes, students need to see people that look like them, but is plugging in one stock photo or another really doing the work?
Nope. Like, you're doing these things so you can check off those boxes. It's really upsetting that DEI is treated like something you can just check off your list.
Right. I think those things are a good place to start, sure. But what else can be done that's more impactful, that reaches beyond superficial elements of identity?
For me, incorporating literature is a way to bring depth to the conversation. But I think that we need to be intentional. Chimamanda is one of those authors who writes from a very personal perspective, right? Because you can feel that she's not watering down the experience for a larger audience. She's really writing about what her life in Nigeria has been and was, but she's also very transnational in her writing. And I think that kind of authenticity is what's going to bring about a more authentic and reflective experience for your students.
Yeah.
And I think that when we do pull in authors from different backgrounds, we have to be careful of how we're framing their experiences. So instead of saying, here is this Nigerian author and she represents Nigeria, let's learn from this, we shed light on the Nigerian identity as being multiplicitous and not monolithic, that someone like Chimamanda would absolutely be a resource in starting to understand subtleties of Nigerian culture, but that her experience is uniquely hers.
Yes, that multilateral identity. I think that's an excellent point, that we don't want to present the stereotype. This is actually another vein that Chimamanda explores in that same talk. She cites her roommate from college who couldn't believe that she knew how to use a stove and that her English was so strong.
So sad. But she got those assumptions from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
The roommate must have engaged with stories that represented Nigeria in that light. And although the fact that this sort of singular narrative exists for nearly any group is problematic, what's more problematic is when those narratives are accepted as the whole truth surrounding someone from that group.
Well, yeah, like if you just keep representing the stereotype of this person, then they're going to think, well, I guess that's the only thing people think of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like with the first Thanksgiving story, Native Americans constantly being represented as peaceful, welcoming, cooperative, and never really even mentioning which tribe and culture they're a part of in that specific story, never giving air to the complex context and rich personal and collective histories they possess.
Right. And I mean, I think that there are more examples now than before. Perhaps because our collective consciousness has started to wake up, people are becoming more aware of this as an issue. And so we see more of an effort to represent people in different lights. But I think we need to keep pushing that in our classrooms in particular, in the way that we present the exact examples we create, or maybe we take something from a textbook and change it.
Right. We can't stop at the stereotypes, because when we do, what we understand to be true through our perspectives and biases bleed into our actions, leading to discriminatory behavior.
So I think besides, that more subtle framing we talked about, a lot of these decisions take place in the planning stages when you're planning a single class, but at a higher level when you're planning your syllabus or curriculum for the course.
Yes. Many of us are now at the end of the semester or quarter, and it's an overwhelming time, but this is the time to start gearing up to create your new syllabus. What are we going to put in that syllabus that's really disrupting the content, going beyond just, oh, I picked that minoritized author, like I got 2 of them in there and I'm good, case closed, like it's fine. But I mean, the rest can all be like, white authors, because the world's used to that voice. Like, no.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought up the syllabus. We've talked about getting students to use their voices, considering how content can be altered to better align with diverse student identities. But I want to tap into this idea of wielding power from a structural standpoint, the syllabus.
The almighty syllabus.
So, as we mentioned at the start of this episode, we have very limited views and understandings of the world in many ways. So something that I always do is have my students put together a book list or share with me, like have some sort of ongoing compilation of what it is that they're reading or what it is they stumbled across recently that really resonated with them, that relates to course material, even tangentially. I ask myself how I can incorporate what's being considered in their mind as sort of the ideal voice of whatever group it is that they belong to. And in doing this, I end up with a syllabus that's more inclusive and well-rounded, and honestly better than anything I could have just put forth on my own.
I love that, because it's hitting both points that we're making here: content inclusion and giving voice to your students.
And allowing them to select what aligns best with their experiences, rather than selecting content that I think aligns with the students that are represented in my classroom, brings meaning and heightened representation. That's not to say that my work is done, but I do think that it enriches what I do, having those different perspectives.
Yeah. But we do have the power, and this is why we're focusing on this very specific realm. It's that within our classroom, we do have the power to shape the way that we present things, right? We have the power to select. We have the power to shift the focus or shift the wording or whatever it is we need to do.
Ensure the way that you operate is conscious. And for us language educators, we want to make sure we're representing more than just our own perspectives and experiences in the materials we present in the classroom. And that in incorporating voices that aren't ours, doing so in a way that expands notions of identity.
Absolutely. So teachers, we want to hear from you. How do you go about incorporating diverse voices and realities in your curriculum? What strategies do you use to ensure that diversity is represented in your classroom?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
And we also welcome your donations if you're feeling in the spirit of giving, even with your consciousness of what Thanksgiving can represent. We do hope you'll consider donating to our podcast so we can keep the episodes and the exploration of these complex topics going.
And for more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud.
To make a donation or buy some podcast swag, head over to teacherthinkaloud.com/support-us.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.